Hello and welcome to the Santee Church of Christ Bible Study Rewind, where we go over and review what we talked about in class the last time. So if you want to catch up, you can just watch this 20-25 minute video and get caught up. We are currently in Deuteronomy chapter 14, the very last couple of verses there we kind of touched on. We're going to go through chapter 15 and break just a little bit into 16. We're not really going to get into 16 because it is a very important chapter to the Christian as well as to these people back in the day. So we see in Deuteronomy chapter 12, God starts establishing his rules for how they are to act when they get into the new land. First and foremost, get rid of idolatry. Establish the place that God says to establish, where to worship him. Chapter 13, remove heresies in the land, false prophets, rebellious children, rebellious friends, or even family, what to do in those cases. Chapter 14, he talks about clean food and tithing. So those are kind of actually related when you think about it in specific ways. We're going to finish the concept of tithing. And then in chapter 15, he starts getting into, Moses starts getting into community and giving, and how how the person was to purpose in their hearts to give, which that concept doesn't go away. Even in the New Testament, it's the same sort of thing. So when we get to verse 27 of chapter 14, verse 27 of chapter 14, Moses says, "You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no portion nor inheritance with you. At the end of 3 years, even the same year, you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase, and you shall lay it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the alien, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates, shall come and eat and be satisfied, so that Jehovah your God may bless you in all the work of your hand, which you do." So here's this final tithing that was to happen every 3 years. Unlike the other two tithes that were to be eaten before God, this happened within your own township, within your own community, within your gates, as they were called back in the day. So this was more about taking care of people within your community, including the Levite, who did not get large inheritance of land, and your people in your community, the foreigner, poor people, people who did not have as much opportunity as you might have had. So why was this tithe important? And I just said every 3 years the tithe eating was to include the Levite, foreigner, and the less fortunate people. The Levite had no land inheritance, so God was commissioning a gift that would sustain them, and there were other gifts as well. There were to be more instructions on providing for the priesthood later. God's system provides for the poor within a community, and those people who fell on hard times. And we see that in the book of Ruth. What was God's goal? Well, I said, so Jehovah your God may bless you in all your work of your hand, which you do. So how does that even work? I mean, if you're tithing, how is God, what does that mean? How does that work? Isn't God going to bless you anyway? Well, apparently, yes, God will bless you, but he expected you to act a specific way. In this case, you're giving of your own means to support people who can't. Interesting concept, right? This is an interesting argument against a belief-only teaching when it comes to God's blessings. Belief has never been the only requirement. The last generation before this one believed, but they fell in the desert because they lacked the faith to do what God commanded. God is just. Without a manifestation of our faith by our works, we do not afford God the opportunity for mercy. And this is something that people kind of don't like to hear this. They want to think that God will give mercy where he's giving mercy, even if it's unjust. Well, God, by his very nature, says himself he won't do that. And God just simply doesn't change. Okay, so I'll get into everybody's answers when I'm done here. So in this first section of, before we get into this first section of chapter 15, well, actually, I'm thinking of something else. We'll get into the last part of chapter 15 was where it was something that we didn't really cover much, but we'll get into that. So, in the first part of chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. So, immediately after talking about tithing and giving of your own means to help others, it was basically 20% twice, 10% twice a year, and then every 3 years within your own communities, you'd give another 10%. So that year it was 30%. And we'll get into some of the questions some of us had. At the end of every 7 years, you shall make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Everyone who has a loan to his neighbor shall release it. And there's a lot of argument as to what that means. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because a release has been proclaimed for Jehovah. You may exact it from a foreigner, but your hand shall release whatever is yours with your brother. Only that there shall be no one in need among you. And this is a very important statement. For Jehovah will greatly bless you in the land that Jehovah your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess it. There is the component of faith. Don't worry about what you're giving, because God's going to take care of you. Only if hearing you listen to the voice of God, to take heed to do all this command which I am commanding you today. So if you listen to God, he will bless you. If you do this, he will bless you. For Jehovah your God will bless you as he promised you, and you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. And you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If there is a poor man among you, one of your brothers inside of your gates and your land which Jehovah your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your needy brother. So what was to happen every 7 years? Well, it's this year of release, right? And how does this foreshadow God's work in the future? Well, this word release, shemitah, actually means remission of debt. And any Christian, when we hear that word remission, that burns inside of us, because we understand that Jesus remitted for our sins by being sacrificed. There was a directive not to borrow from foreigners, though it was okay to lend to them. The thought of remission is prolific in the Christian, in that Jesus sets us free from the debt of sin, as I said, through his sacrifice. The Christian understands that this is wholly and just completely a blessing from God, and we look to do the same in the lives of others. The Christian also understands that borrowing, in other words, we look to try and bless others from the blessings that we receive from God. The Christian also understands that borrowing puts themselves in a position of servitude to the lender. And in the spiritual sense, Christians do not allow undue influences in their lives. So if we're going to owe somebody, we have to make sure that it does not impede on our service to God. Things that cause a compromise toward God are not to be included in the Christian life. Okay, so verses 8 through 18 say this, and I'm going to include verse 7. If there's a poor man among you, one of your brothers inside any of your gates, in the land which Jehovah your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your needy brother, but opening you shall open your hand to him, and lending you shall lend him enough for his need in that which he lacks. Beware that there is no evil thought in your heart, saying, well, the seventh year, the year of release is coming, and then your eye be evil against your needy brother, and you give him nothing. And he cry to Jehovah against you, and it be sin to you. Giving you shall give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because Jehovah your God will bless you for this thing in all your work and in all that you put your hand to. So there's that component of faith again. For the poor will never cease from the midst of the land. On account of this I command you, saying, opening you shall open your hand to your poor and needy brother in your land. If your brother, and this is specifically speaking of the Hebrew brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. So yes, there were slaves back in that day. That's just how things worked. It was actually a good thing to be a slave instead of starving. And when you send him out from you, you shall not let him go away empty. You shall richly adorn him from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your winepress, that which Jehovah your God blessed you, and you shall give to him. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah your God redeemed you. On account of this, I command you this thing today, and it shall be if he says to you, I will not go out from you. In other words, if the slave says, I don't want to leave, because he loves you and your house, because it was good for him to be with you, then you shall take an awl, and you shall put it through his ear and through the door, and he shall be your slave forever. And you shall do so to your slave girl as well, and it shall not seem hard in your eyes when you send him away from you, for to the double of the hire of a hireling he has served you 6 years, and Jehovah your God will bless you in all that you do. So after a slave serves you for 6 years, the Israelite was to release that slave. And if the slave decided, no, I love my master and I want to stay, then you took the awl and you stuck it through his ear and into the door, which kind of symbolizes to me anyway that you know he's now he's attached to you and your household. And this was a forever thing. Now they belong to you forever. So so what was to be the heart of the people? And this keeps coming up to me that this is all about faith. Don't worry about this giving. It's going to help your communities. It's going to help the people in the cities that are poor and don't have as many opportunities as you. And you have to understand, he's saying, look, don't worry about it. I will take care of you, is what God is saying. He's bringing them to faith. Verse 15 applies the context. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. If a brother or a fellow countryman is in need, lend money to him. Do not regard the fact that 7-year cycle is happening where he doesn't have to repay you. Just give him the money. So God will because God will take care of you. Don't have a grievous or spoiled attitude about it. That's what that word means. Don't be spoiled about it. If you own a Hebrew slave, release them after 6 years of service and make sure they leave the property, they leave with property for their service. And God is saying, look, if somebody serves you, you better take care of them. If they decide they want to stay, then a ceremony was performed to seal the deal, to signify the slave being attached to the home and the owner. That person would become a slave for their lifetime or forever. I assume that there were some rights that would come to the slave at that point, but there isn't anything mentioned here. If they leave, he's saying, don't be upset by it. They were to consider the value that person brought to their life. And with these guidelines, God would bless the Hebrew. So in the very last part of chapter 15, I'm just going to put it in there as a note. God says, "You shall appoint judges and the firstling males that are born of your herd and of your flock, you shall sanctify to Jehovah your God. You shall do no work with the firstling of your ox, nor shear the firstling of your flock. You shall eat it before Jehovah your God year by year in the place which Jehovah shall choose, you and your household. And if there is any blemish in it, lameness, blindness, or any evil blemish, whatever, you shall not sacrifice it to Jehovah your God. You shall eat it inside your gates, the unclean and the clean alike, as the gazelle and the hart. Only don't eat its blood." So that is the precursor to chapter 16, where he starts talking about the Passover. It's almost like it needed to be in chapter 16, in my opinion. Okay, so what were some of the other comments that were made by some of the other people in the class? Well, one person concerning the tithes asked, was the 3-year tithe a 3 years of savings, or was it specific to that moment? And when we read the text says the tithe was on the gain that you had for that year, or for that harvest or increase. It wasn't on your total. It wasn't on your total assets. It was for the gain. So if you gained something that year, 10% of that was to go to God. So no, it really wasn't about saving up for 3 years or anything like that. It was just about the gain for that time, and that was pretty much about first fruits, and it was very tied very closely to these sacrifices like that. It was also specific to the community, unlike the other tithes. This is specific to these blessings go to people that you know firsthand. The guy, the Levite in your midst, or maybe the prophet, or the poor person, or the foreigner, or the person who doesn't have as many opportunities as you do. God says that there should be nobody in need, that their needs are taken care of. That doesn't mean that they're made rich and that you're made poor. And that was the point that somebody made about that later, and we'll get into that. This was an act of faith. The giver gives it away, knowing that God will return it to them. Okay, so what about this 7 years thing? This giving, this release of debt and things, and that's still driving towards the idea of faith. Full forgiveness, or is it just there are arguments as to whether you forgave the whole debt or you just forgave the payments for that year. I'm not going to get into that because my understanding is just a moot point and nobody can come to an agreement completely on it. The first concern was not to make money from somebody, and this is what somebody brought up. Danny brought this up. That this was an act of mercy, and this is a foreshadowing of God having mercy on us. And this is for the person who is in need, and we're not exploiting people. We're not exploiting our brothers. Especially we see that even still today in the New Testament. When they're giving to the church. It doesn't mean you don't give to your community in general. But in this instance, and even in the New Testament writing, we see the churches and the brotherhood being taken care of first. There's no usury from the brothers or family, and it's okay to do that with foreigners, but not with people in this case, within the Hebrew nation. And that gets extended into Christianity, and people don't like that, but that's the truth of the matter. There was to be no one in need among the brethren. And what about the person who will not work? This question came out, what if somebody moves in with you and they're just lazy and they don't want to work? Do we just keep giving them money till we become poor? What do we do in a case like that? Are we under compulsion to give? And that's a great question because it happens. And one of the very good answers was we should always err on the side of mercy and being generous, have a generous heart, and being wronged. Paul talks about being wronged by a Christian brother. Instead of taking him to court, just be wronged. It's better to be wronged than to not be able to work things out. And then there were other things we talked about. We know that Paul talks about that if a man will not work, he will not eat. Sometimes, even if you're a Christian, you have to show just tough love with somebody, even with people that we love. If you're going to go into a sort of agreement with somebody that you're going to let them live with you, or you're going to take care of them, that's not alone, maybe you set parameters on that. And you say, look, you can stay here for this amount of time, and I think this is what we should see in this amount of time. You should get a job. You should be, gainfully employed. And if you don't know how, then you're going to do this and this, and then we're going to make sure that you get a job. And if they don't do it, then they've broken their own covenant with you. We don't want to enable bad behavior, and I do agree with that. This text, and this is brought up, really kind of also encourages us to budget for those times when somebody may come into our lives where they need help and we're ready to help them. Just like we budget to give to church every week or whatever we do. So through 7 through 18, what about the poor? And what about those people, what about this slave that they had, people that was working for them? That's really what it was. It was just people working for them. We have a bad connotation on slaves because of American history, but like I said earlier, if there wasn't slavery in place, and you were born without opportunity, you were destitute. And so, but if you had if you were willing to work and you had a mind to work for somebody and help them with their increase, then you became a slave. And in some instances, you would work for a certain amount of years. In this case, 6 years. We saw that happen earlier in the Bible with Jacob working for his uncle. I think it was his uncle. Yeah. Anyway, we see that happening throughout history, and here it is being just put into a law form. It's a matter of faith, and this is we kind of jumped directly to the Christian application. It's a matter of faith, and this is what keeps coming up in Deuteronomy for us. You don't see this word faith come up, but it's the implication of faith is all throughout this. God says, I'm going to take care of you. You have to rely on me. And it's a matter of faith, and we have become servants for God. He has put his all through our ear, and now we belong to him. And when we turn our lives over to God, that's essentially what he does. He attaches us to his home. And again, he called them sons. And what that means are builders. That word sons means builders, and we are builders of God's house. We are builders for God's word, and to let people know what that word is and the gift that God is willing to give them. Giving of our material wealth is only 10%, but there's so much more to us than just our material wealth. We like to think, well, sometimes we don't have money. We think, well, I don't have much to give. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because material wealth has little to do with what God is looking for. God is looking for us to give 100% of ourselves to him every single day, and that means considering others, being compassionate towards others, being friendly to people, not being evil toward them, not lying, all these things that God expects from us. That's giving of ourselves to others. Being polite to people. It's as simple as that. And maybe we don't feel like being polite. Well, it doesn't matter. What matters is the things that are godly and more spiritual. And the book of Romans really gets into it really well. Ephesians as well. We show our love by loving others, and remember that we were all slaves at one time, and that's the humility of the Christian. So I did read the end of chapter 15, and I'm going to make sure we do that again before we get into the chapter 16, because chapter 16 starts with the Passover and the three main festivals that the Israelite was to perform every year. And this is a big deal. This is a foundational thing. So the end of chapter 15 talks about that perfect sacrifice. And that is the segue into chapter 16. So that's the lesson from last week. If you'd like to join us anytime, you can drop us a note through either our Facebook page, our YouTube page, or our main website. And we can include you in on the class. Right now, we're not doing it in our building because of COVID restrictions. We're doing it online. But hopefully we'll be back together and we'll be able to do this in class. And so it's so much more efficient. And, technology is only so good. Being together is way better. So that's it. I want to say thank you for listening. And you're invited anytime to ask us anything. If you have any questions about God or about the Bible or its validity, or how is it that you guys can have faith, go ahead and drop us a note. Thank you. Thank you for listening. May God bless you. Thank you.